don't care how you do it. I just want it done. And then it'll get done in a way I did not, where I always talk about the bizarro world version of my instruction. Like, yes, I said all those words and I can understand how you would assume those words meant that thing. And yet that is absolutely the opposite of what I meant by it. Are you feeling overwhelmed, stuck, or uncertain about how to grow your business without sacrificing what really matters most? Welcome to The Business You Really Want, the show for women ready to build a sustainable, fully aligned business. Aligned with what, you ask? You, your values, your life. Seriously, it is possible. I'm Tonya Kubo, and along with business advisor extraordinaire Gwen Bortner, we're here to show you how. Do you find yourself overwhelmed and struggling to scale your business? Tonya here, back with operations expert extraordinaire Gwen Bortner. What I love about doing the intro to the episodes is I get to say obnoxious things about Gwen, and she can't stop me because we're recording. So we are here to deliver a tough truth today. The business you really want depends on your ability to master the art of true delegation, which, by the way, true delegation is actually required in order to be an effective leader. I know. You've tried to delegate. You've hired help. Maybe, like me, you've even bribed a teen or two. I've enrolled my babysitter in the business at times. The problem is all you get is more work and more stress because nobody, and I do mean nobody, does it, whatever it is, quite like you do. Or, again, if you're like me, you can't manage to find mind readers. I've tried at every price point. But seriously, what is common sense to me has almost never been common sense to anybody I have ever hired. And because I work with Gwen here in her business and I have met her clients, I actually know I'm not alone. This may be a me problem, but it's not just a me problem. So Gwen, when I first came to you ages ago, before we ever worked together, whining about how my favorite VA in the entire world never quite rose to the level of being my right hand in business, you actually, and I don't know if you remember this, but you pressed me on my effectiveness as a leader. And something you said started with understanding what true delegation is. What I want you to do, just to start us off today, is expand on that. What is true delegation, and how do you think me and other entrepreneurs get it wrong?
So first, true delegation is really hard.
Okay, thank you. I feel validated right now. I feel seen.
But that's the thing that kind of nobody says. That right. It's like, oh, just delegate it. Like it's all you have to do is this should take you 5 seconds. I don't know why you're struggling over it. I mean,
just write a checklist. Do you know how many people have told me to just write a stinking checklist?
Oh yeah, well, no, because that's a giant, probably big old number, and such. Well, I mean, that isn't part of it. That's useful, but it's not enough by a long shot. And so I think that's the first and biggest problem is delegation is always presented as you just tell people what to do and then they just go do it, right? Yeah, that's delegation. That is so not even close to delegation. Truly delegating is a multi-phase, long-term process that takes a lot of effort up front. And so the whole idea of, oh, just get this off your plate, just give it to somebody else. I really focus on, okay, so how often are you going to be doing this? Mm-hmm. How often does this happen? How much time does this take? Are you actually going to be investing enough time and have it give enough ROI in the long term because it's going to come back and for true delegation, because it's not, we'll sit down for 30 minutes. I'll show you how it's done. And now I've delegated. That is, I mean, there are probably things that actually can be delegated that way, but the bulk of what entrepreneurs are trying to hand off, that is not the case. So
Okay.
that's the first issue. It's
All right.
way bigger than anybody talks about.
Okay. So it's way bigger than anybody talks about. That's the first issue. What's the second?
The second issue is it is truly a multi-phase process. So phase one is making sure they understand how to do the thing. And a lot of people think they have now delegated. That's only phase one. There's usually, depending on the type of task and the levels and all that, it can be somewhere between 3 and 5 phases. Okay. But for any level of true delegation, there has to be at least three phases. So the first phase is, let's make sure you know what the thing is that you're actually doing and how to do it. Okay. And that part is, I'll say, the easiest phase because it's the most obvious. But the second phase is where you're starting to not have to have you, CEO, not having to have responsibility for the completion. And this is where most people start going wrong, is they're really just handing off the task. They aren't delegating. Delegating says you are fully responsible. And there's a step between being fully responsible and learning the task. And that's that intermediate phase where you start giving them some responsibility, but you're starting to check back. So they're starting to have some accountability for doing the thing the way it needs to be done in the time that it needs to be done. But you're not just, advocating all responsibility for it at this point, until there is consistent demonstration that they actually are able and willing to take responsibility. And then we really turn the full responsibility over. And when it's not done, as CEO, it's still always ultimately your problem, but they need to really be held truly accountable for it not being done, because they knew what it was, how to do it, when it was due, what the impacts are, all of the things. And most people don't do that second and third phase. Now, sometimes you've got some intermediate phases between what I'm calling first and third phase, because it's a bigger level of responsibility. And so you may need to do that. What I'm calling phase 2 might actually take 2 phases or 3 phases. And when I say phases, I'm really talking about time. That, it's not like today we're in phase 1, tomorrow we're in phase 2, and the next day we're in phase 3. This is usually a time thing, so that we can actually see that there's understanding over time.
Yeah. Let me pause you right there, because I think I got lost in the phases. And so...
Okay, I can understand that.
Yeah. And I wrote stuff down, because you know me, I take notes here. Everybody thinks I walk in and this is perfectly scripted, and would they be wrong? They would be so wrong.
Surprise!
So we're talking about responsibility delegation, and that's how I feel like we're talking, like that's what true delegation is, I think, as you've described it. So step 1 or phase 1 would be making sure you as the CEO know how to do the thing that you are delegating. So you know how to do it, you know how to teach it, you know how to hand it off. Phase 2 would be that you start to hand it off, or maybe hand off aspects of it, paying attention, like checking for understanding, making sure that it's being done according to expectations or however it's needed to be done. And then phase 3 would be that it's fully handed off. You have given them the responsibility, and so they know what the deadline is, they know what the desired outcome is, and how they get from here to there is fully under their ownership. And then phase 4 is that you hold them accountable to that. So if anything falls apart, you're not racing in to save the day, even though as a CEO, at the end of the day, the only person around to save the day is you. Right. But you are actually allowing them to maybe sit in the discomfort of their mistake and solve it. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And what you did is you added what I would call phase 0, is that you actually understand what it is that you're trying to hand off.
Okay.
Right. I started at, that, and you're doing,
okay.
You're doing the initial task training. That for me was my phase 1.
Okay. And then is there like using my numbers here as an example?
Right. So we would call it everywhere? Your phase 2. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a phase 5, or is it just?
Well, there can be a phase 5 depending on the level of complexity and the risk to the business, where you don't just jump from your phase 3 to phase 4. There could be an intermediary phase in there that's giving them a little more responsibility, and sometimes there can be multiple phases in there, depending on the level of risk of what happens if this goes sideways.
Got it. So if we were using the example of stair steps,
yeah,
in some cases, right, it's a simple staircase of knowing what it is that you need to delegate, like knowing how to do that yourself so that you can then train somebody else to do it, training them to do it, and training them to do it in a way that you're breaking it off into manageable pieces. You're checking for understanding each step of the way so that by the time that they're fully trained, they can actually be self-sufficient. That's really what delegating the responsibility is. They are entirely self-sufficient. They can go from here to there. You don't need to know those intermediary details. They don't need to ask you for permission or clarification at each little micro step in the process.
And then the responsibility piece means they also know how to solve problems within reason, even if you haven't specifically said, if so-and-so does X, you do Y.
Right. So they don't just know how to do the specific task. They understand the why behind the what. They understand so that they can make those independent decisions without consulting you.
Yeah. That's when we're getting into they've got some responsibility for it.
Right. Okay. And so they're like 80% accurate to how you would do it. Yep. But even if it's only 80% accurate to how you would do it, the wheels are not going to fall off the bus because they did it differently than you. And then the final phase is the accountability piece, where you are holding them accountable so that when they do make mistakes, whether they get something right or they get something wrong, you allow them to own that.
Which means that you allow them to fix it. You allow them to celebrate it. You also allow them to start making adjustments to it based on what they're seeing actually works in their reality.
Okay. Oh, you just prompted like 5 questions that we do not have time to answer, which is it's why it's great that we have more than one episode. So I want to just take a step back now that you've explained sort of this responsibility delegation piece. How does that compare to task delegation?
So task delegation is just saying, here are the things I want you to do, and I'm going to double check that you did all of them. Okay. So I own the responsibility. I own whether or not it gets done. I own all of those things. So if, for instance, I'm trying to come up with a really, simple, great example of a task delegation that's fine as a task.
Well, I actually think I have one. Can I share?
Let's use yours then.
Yeah, I want to use, and it actually involves our business. But because I think that you can let me know if I got this wrong. Okay, so as part of our business model, we do a like weekly micro coaching, right? We call it the weekly course of action. But how it involves is our clients answer 4 or 5. See, I don't know all the details here, but let's just say 4 for the sake of argument. I'll make that up. They answer 4 reflection questions every single week. And they do this at the end of their week. And at the beginning of their week, you or me will review their answers and, we'll give them direct one-on-one feedback based on how they responded. Now, we have two team members who help us with this. We have one team member, but she helps us with it in 2 ways. So when we have Andrea, she's in charge of our client care, and her job is to go through our client list and see who filled out the reflection questions for the week, so that neither you nor I is spending a bunch of time opening empty Google Docs, because that's not fun for either of us. And I know you don't like to pay me for opening empty Google Docs. It just doesn't make financial sense. And Andrea checks, she goes through kind of an attendance sheet for that, right? And so that's her task. Every Monday, she's going through that attendance sheet, she's marking it, and then you or me come behind her, and we only open the documents that have a check mark by them, because we know those have been completed. That's the task piece. And when we brought Andrea on, that was the job we gave her, and that is what she did. And somewhere along the way, and I will admit it, Gwen, I don't know when this changed. I just know that when I had to cover for you on a vacation, it was in place and I thought it was awesome. Somewhere along the way, Andrea decided that anybody who hadn't filled out their reflection questions, she would then reach out to them and give them a reminder. And what she would do is she wouldn't send them a separate email. She made it super easy, is she would just tag them so that they would get an email that said, hey, just in case you forgot, you have until noon today to to answer your reflection questions if you want Gwen or Tonya to look it over. And then all they had to do was click into that email and they would go straight to the document, straight to the place where they needed to fill it out. So based on what you're saying, I feel like Andrea independently went from being delegated to a task to taking full responsibility for making sure that as many of our clients as possible took advantage of that weekly touch point with us. Is that a good example?
That is a great example.
Okay.
Because ultimately, because I'm currently the one who spends most of the time going through it, I have held responsibility for making sure that that is done, right? That we're going through it and whatnot. But with her doing that, she has taken on a little bit of additional responsibility for it. Now, part of it is time, that she's been doing it for long enough. And as she did it, we also had a discussion because she did it completely independently of me, which was not a problem at all. But there was a piece that she hadn't thought about, that it was also doing a training thing that I wasn't wanting to be done. And so we talked about, okay, well, what does that mean? and we made some adjustments, but it wasn't me owning the responsibility. It was just me helping her think through the process and what she had decided to do. But it wasn't me, immediately saying, oh, you're doing that wrong.
Right. Okay.
Because that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
She was doing it differently than I would ever have done it. Doesn't mean it was wrong.
Right. And doesn't mean it was bad.
Doesn't mean it was bad.
And sometimes I think, so this is where I put my own CEO hat on, because I am the type of person, when I delegate, like, I just want it done. I don't care how you do it. I just want it done. And then it'll get done in a way I did not, where I always talk about the bizarro world version of my instruction. Like, yes, I said all those words and I can understand how you would assume those words meant that thing. And yet that is absolutely the opposite of what I meant by it. Right? So, and that's when it starts to feel like more work than it's worth to have a team. So help me understand, and really help our listener understand, because you've drilled this into my head long enough that I get it to some degree. But why is it important to grant full ownership and accountability to your team members? Like, why not just say, go do this, and then have them come back and then say, okay, now go do this?
Because then you're still holding all of those, I'm going to call them open loops in your head, right? You still own, it's like, oh, did that get done? Oh, I don't know if that got done. I better check. Did that get done? Oh, is so-and-so happening? Because it's now still my responsibility to make sure it happens. And I don't have to be the one who makes sure it happens. Using another example from our world, we created an onboarding process, and we kind of developed it in concert together. So this was a little bit different than me just delegating it. Like, we had a great process in place, and we delegated it over to Andrea. But the reality is, I don't ever think about, after someone has said they want to start working with us and has made the initial payment, and the ball has officially started rolling, I never worry about whether or not they got onboarded, because it's not my responsibility. It's Andrea's responsibility. Even though if they don't get onboarded, it is my responsibility because I'm the CEO.
Well, then follow that through with me, because that sounds contradictory to me, right? It's like you don't ever worry about whether they've been onboarded because that's Andrea's responsibility. Yet if they're not onboarded, that is a problem for you. So following this logic, what do you do if somebody isn't onboarded? Like, let's just, somebody reaches out to you and says, you promised me I would get my onboarding call within 3 days, and it's been 3 weeks.
Then my first thing is I reach out. I say, well, that is very unusual. I am so glad you reached out to me. Let me check into that and get back to you. I don't immediately say, oh, let me set your onboarding call and we'll do that right now. Because back to not my responsibility.
Okay.
My responsibility is to hold Andrea accountable to doing it. So my next thing is to say, Andrea, Georgette, whoever, I'm making up a name.
I like Georgette. That's a good fake name. I always have Susie. So go ahead.
Has, reached out and said they didn't get an onboarding call, which seems really unusual because you're really good at doing this. Now, if this had been the 4th time that had happened, this would be a very different kind of conversation.
You also wouldn't lie and say, oh, you're usually really good if this had been the 4th time.
Yeah, no, that would be a very, very different conversation. But with Andrea, this would be a true conversation. It's like, you're really usually good with this. They said it's been 3 weeks. They haven't had an onboarding call. Have you been reaching out and they're just not seeing it? Has it landed someplace strange in their email? Do we need to actually give them a phone call so that we, can work through what happened? I need to hear from her what she thinks happened, because often it's someone else's perspective of I didn't get the onboarding call. Now that means that we need to adjust conversations and, there's other things that we need to do behind the scenes. But it's not my job to fix it. It's Andrea's job to fix it. And it's Andrea and my job to figure out what went wrong and for me to help her figure out how to fix it. But it's still her job to fix it.
Okay.
Because she's fully responsible for it.
And because you brought it up, so that's the process if it's the first time it happened. Maybe that's the process if it's the second time it happened. So what's the process if this is the 4th time it happened?
The 4th time it happened, by the second time, like if it, it's happened once and then like 9 months later it happens again, that's a, right. we're not forming a pattern, right? Yeah. But it happened once last month and it happened again this month. We're starting to see a pattern. So at the second time, it's like, well, this is weird. This has happened like 2 times, pretty close together. We really need to not have this happen. And, if we need to talk about it, we can talk about it differently and have a fairly positive, but by the 3rd conversation, it's like, okay, so this is now a problem. And now we're going to take corrective action. That can be all sorts of things depending on the level of what it is, what's going on in their world. There are all sorts, context matters, right? So right. There's a lot of factors. I can't say I would just fire them because I wouldn't necessarily, but I might, right? Depending on what other things are going on. And so if it becomes a pattern, then we really have to look and say, why is this becoming a pattern? Is it a pattern because something else has changed that is really causing another problem? Is it something behind the scenes? Because often these kinds of things would be like, it's a technology issue that all of a sudden none of our email is landing in their inbox. It's landing in their, spam, junk, promotions, whatever. They're never seeing it. And therefore that's really where the problem is. So it then goes into, let's look at root cause analysis. What is the issue? Is this a person issue? Has, she just decided she doesn't like working for me and she's going to piss all my clients off? Not exactly what I would ever expect Andrew to do, but these things do happen in the real world. That's handled differently than, hey, this maybe is a technology issue. Let's figure out what's going on and fix that. That's where we start looking if it becomes an issue. But here's the thing. If you've actually delegated properly through the process early on and didn't try to hand it off too fast, rarely does this other thing ever become a real problem?
Right.
Because as soon as it happens the second time, Andrew's like, this should not be happening 2 times in a row. And because it's her responsibility, she starts looking, how do we fix it? What's going on?
Yeah. And so what I like about how you just walked us through this, your steps, like your thought process and how you handle it, is at no point in time, and obviously maybe you're just sounding like a saint and you internally have a whole different dialogue going on. I know you're a saint. But at no point in time in this process did I see you assign intent to the action. Because, see, where I see CEOs go off the rails when it comes to delegating is, rather than going, that's interesting, this client didn't get the onboarding call, or this client doesn't believe they got the onboarding call, we need to figure out what happened. I see them go into, oh my gosh, they didn't schedule the onboarding because I cut their hours this week, or they didn't schedule the onboarding because they want more hours, because I don't pay them enough, because of this, because of that, because they have other clients that are more important to me, right? And they work it into this personal attack versus it simply being a business, a training, maybe even an operations issue.
Well, and this part I actually am a saint about. I will say that. That I rarely assume malintent until it becomes evident that it is malintent.
Right.
And then I act on it very, very quickly. I have zero patience for it. If you say you're doing work and I'm seeing no evidence of it, and we talk about it at least once or twice, and I'm still seeing no evidence, then you're actually not doing work and telling me you are. That's a whole different problem. Right. But I don't assume anybody's ever wanting to do a bad job.
Right.
Now, sometimes they're just not capable of doing a good job. That's a whole different issue.
Yes.
Right. But by assuming that they aren't trying to do a bad job, then we can both approach it with less emotions. And this would be where I am saint-like, that I don't put a lot of emotion into anything that I'm looking at within my business until such time it really is justified. I don't start there. I only end there. And most of the time I don't get there, because rarely, like I said, are things done with actual mal intent.
Right. I mean, most people want to do a good job. Most people want to win. They want the organization to win. I think a lot of people who, especially those in support roles, get a lot of satisfaction and validation from making their supervisor, their CEO, look good. Like, that's important to them. I know anytime I've been in the work world and I've had an assistant, whether that was, I was an employee somewhere and had an assistant, or I had hired somebody to be my assistant, I always felt like they were driven to make me look good in all cases. And what really gutted them more than anything is if they made a mistake that they felt like affected the public perception of me. So that aligns with what I know to be true. However, I still see sometimes CEOs just don't quite feel that, or here's what I really think happens. And because what I'd like to do is I'd like you to provide some tips for us in overcoming these barriers, like getting between here and there if delegation is a barrier for me. What I often see is not doing it like me equals doing it wrong. If I don't watch, so that's one thing I see. The other thing I see is if I'm not touching every single step in the process, you can't possibly be doing it right. So that's like that micromanaging. And the constant questioning of decisions. And so are you sure that that's the right thing? Well, are you sure? Can you check again for me? Show me where you did this. That I think builds up to making the other person feel like nothing they do is right. And they can't they can't take their second breath without permission. Help me, just give me a couple of tips. Like there's somebody and they are listening right now and this is their problem and they want to get past it. What are a couple of ways they can do that?
So I had 3 things pop into mind, and right now only 2 are remaining. So
that's okay. We'll take the 2
and see if the third one shows up. So the first is the more you can approach the problem with curiosity, as opposed to anything else, to say, so that was an interesting choice. Why did you choose to do it that way? Instead of, why are you not doing it the way I told you? Right. It's a completely different, it's like, so that's an interesting choice. Why did you choose to do it that way? Well, because of this and this and this. Now,
I think you've said that exactly to me, actually, several times. That's an interesting choice, Tonya. Tell me why you chose to do it that way.
Well, and part of it is sometimes it's because I didn't give enough context, and so you chose to do things that really don't work given the context. Sometimes it's because my context is too narrow and your context is actually broader, and you're seeing a more complete picture than I am, right? So, but asking it with true curiosity allows it to be like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. That could actually be a really good way to do it. There's also the possibility, it's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's not the right way, but by allowing someone to try it their way and to see why it doesn't work, they're going to learn faster than telling them that it's not going to work. Now, we can't always do that, but most of the people that I work with are not dealing with what I like to call flood, fire, or blood, right? Fire, flood, or blood. It's not that urgent, right? If something just doesn't go quite the way we want this time, the world is not going to, fall apart. So being able to allow people to learn, is part of it. But the curiosity of saying, I never thought of doing it that way. And oh my gosh, that's actually way better. Gets past the, if it's not my way, it's wrong. Right. So that's the first piece. The second thing that struck me is, I think people get worried about micromanaging when either they're and all of those kind of things about letting go of the responsibility, all of the levels, when they're trying to go too quickly from here is the task to it's completely yours.
Right. Because
they aren't getting confident in the person's ability.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's the other thing, is to say, don't try to make this process as short as you possibly can, which is kind of that common idea out there of hire a VA, offload all that stuff, and you're going to have all this free time. And they're making it sound like this should take you less than 30 days.
Yeah.
Rarely does a good delegation process take less than 30 days. Truly a good delegation process. Now, you could get 80% there in 30 days, but you probably aren't getting to true delegation. And then the other is that they get the 75% or 80% and never get the rest of the way. They keep owning it.
Right.
They hold that responsibility. And so it also feels like they're still having to do a lot of the work because they are.
Yeah. Okay. So this is great. Let me recap where we've landed. Because I feel like there was so much in this episode. I want to make sure that our listeners don't lose sight of the key points. So the steps or the phases of true delegation, we're talking about effective delegation here, is first, you need to make sure that you understand the task that you're delegating so that you can accurately communicate it and transfer the knowledge that you have to the other person. Second step is to phase your approach in training so that you're handing off a segment, making sure that that's done according to standard before you add on the next segment, because that will let you know where the blocks are, right? Where the hiccups in the process, where the training fall flat. Then the third step is fully handing over the responsibility. They have been trained. You've checked for understanding at every stage in the process, and now they are fully responsible for whatever that task and role is. And so they know where to go. They know what the deadline is, what winning looks like, and how they get from here to there is entirely on them. And then finally, it is your job as the CEO to hold them accountable to it. So if something falls apart, you don't run in and fix it and not talk to them because you're like, they're too busy or whatever it could be. You actually say, let me look into that. And then you go and you give them the opportunity to speak to what happened, to give their perspective. And if it's a training issue, you solve it then. If it's a perspective issue, you solve it then. If it's a time issue, maybe their job is actually bigger than what they have allotted time or capacity for. Any of that, you can then solve it in real time. And if it's a flub or whatever, you allow them to sit in the discomfort of owning their losses, just like you let them sit in the excitement and exhilaration of owning their wins.
Yep.
All right, so that captures it. And then in terms of if you are a micromanaging person, right, then you need to embrace that. You need to understand that. And then you need to also look at your training process. Because if you feel the need to micromanage, what Gwen is saying here is that chances are you tried to hand off the task too fast, or you tried to hand off the responsibility too quickly. And so look at your training process. If your issue is that they're not doing things exactly like you would do them, I think you need to sit with yourself and really think, like, how important is it that things are done my way versus that they are done a way? And a lot of times that has to do with I would say the imbalance of perception between what I think is critical and what the actual standard is that the client or whoever the end user could be feels. Does that sum it up, Gwen?
It really does. And I think that last point is the biggie of saying it's okay for it to be done a different way. What we're looking at is the outcome. Is the outcome what I need it to be, as opposed to all of the steps? But still evaluating, because sometimes people will add a whole lot of steps that you don't need, and that becomes, that's a whole different, kind of issue. So we're not just doing it blindly, but realizing, one of my favorite things is there's lots of right answers.
Yeah.
And your right answer may not be the only right answer.
Right. And I think that's hard. And that is a topic
that
we'll
we'll
have to talk about another day. Now what I'd like to do is turn the tables. So whether you are watching us or you are listening to us, this is your turn. Because here's the deal. Gwen and I can talk all day long, and we can use our own personal examples to illustrate some of the points we're trying to make. But that's not nearly as much fun for you. I mean, that just sounds like you came to one of our team meetings. What I would love for you to do is you to give us our story. So if delegation is something you're struggling with in your own business, I would love to hear about it. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to drop me an email, seriously, directly to my inbox. Okay. And I promise I check my spam at least once a week. So if it accidentally lands there, I will eventually find it. So I want you to email me at Tonya@everydayeffectiveness.com, and we'll put that in the show notes, but it's Tonya, Tonya, at everydayeffectiveness.com, to tell me your story and to help inform future episodes of the show. Thanks for tuning in to The Business You Really Want with Gwen Bortner. I'm Tonya Kubo, reminding you that sustainable success is within reach. Make sure to subscribe to the show and visit thebusinessyoureallyWant.com for more resources. Until next time, keep dreaming big and acting with intention.